People talk about Florida like it is theme parks and beaches and retirement communities where someone's grandmother does water aerobics at 9 in the morning. They mention Miami, they mention the Keys, maybe they throw in an alligator joke if they are feeling original. And sure, that Florida exists. But there is another one underneath it, one with abandoned launch pads where astronauts burned alive, underwater caves full of Pleistocene bones, a town run entirely by certified mediums, a prison so brutal they wrote a book calling it The American Siberia, and a man in the Everglades who has spent decades hunting a creature that officially does not exist. So subscribe and let's start. 17. Spook Hill, Lake Wales. In the middle of Polk County, on a quiet residential street in a town most people have never heard of, there is a small hill where gravity appears to have forgotten how to do its job. You park your car at the bottom of the slope, put it in neutral, take your foot off the brake, and the car rolls uphill. Not quickly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, the vehicle moves in the wrong direction, and there is no engine running, no trick, no one pushing you from behind. The phenomenon has been documented since at least the 1920s, and probably longer. A sign installed by the city of Lake Wales instructs visitors to stop at the white line, shift to neutral, and observe. The explanation from physicists is the same one applied to every gravity hill on Earth. It is an optical illusion caused by the surrounding landscape. The horizon is obscured by trees, and the terrain slopes in a way that makes a slight downhill grade appear to be uphill. Your brain, deprived of a reliable reference point, misjudges the incline. The Seminole legend is more interesting. According to local tradition, a great warrior chief battled an enormous alligator near this spot, and the struggle was so violent that it disturbed the land itself, leaving the ground permanently scarred and confused. The alligator was killed, but the earth never recovered. People have been testing the hill with their cars ever since the automobile arrived in Central Florida, and nobody has ever been disappointed. The street is called North Avenue, and on most days, you will find at least one person sitting in a parked car with a bewildered expression, watching their vehicle do something it should not be able to do. 16. Coral Castle, Homestead. Between 1920 and 1951, a Latvian immigrant named Edward Ledskalnin, who stood 5 feet tall and weighed roughly 100 pounds, single-handedly carved, moved, and assembled over 1,100 tons of coral limestone into a structure that includes a 9-ton revolving gate, a 28-ton obelisk, a functional rocking chair carved from a single block of stone, and a coral telescope aimed at the North Star. He worked only at night. He never allowed anyone to watch. When a group of teenagers once spied on him from a distance, they claimed to have seen the massive stones floating into position like hydrogen balloons. Ledskalnin said he had discovered the secret used to build the pyramids of Egypt. He never elaborated. He never published his method. Engineers, physicists, and construction professionals who have studied the site have been unable to determine how one man of his stature moved blocks weighing up to 30 tons without heavy machinery, cranes, or even a helper. The most common speculation involves a system of handmade lever and pulley devices, combined with an extraordinary understanding of balance and counterweights. But the truth is that nobody knows for certain, because the only witness was Ledskalnin himself, and he took the answer with him when he died in 1951. The 9-ton gate, which was so precisely balanced that a child could push it open with one finger, eventually stopped working in 1986. When engineers dismantled it for repair, they discovered that the entire gate rotated on a single metal shaft resting on a truck bearing. The engineering was elegant. How Ledskalnin installed it by himself remains unexplained. 15. Devil's Den Spring, Williston. In the flat, unremarkable landscape of Levy County, the ground opens up and swallows itself. What looks like a nondescript patch of Florida scrubland conceals a dry limestone cave with a collapsed roof, and at the bottom of that cave, 54 feet below the surface, is a prehistoric underground spring with water so clear you can see the fossils in the walls from the surface. Devil's Den earned its name from the early settlers who saw steam rising from the hole on cold winter mornings. The spring water stays at a constant 72 degrees year-round, and when the outside air is cold enough, the temperature difference produces a visible mist that rises through the collapsed ceiling like smoke from a furnace. The settlers concluded that they were looking at an entrance to hell and named it accordingly. In 1960, paleontologists conducted at least 96 dives into the spring and found something genuinely extraordinary. In an underwater passage called Chamber 3, 70 feet below the surface, they discovered the remains of 47 species of extinct Pleistocene mammals, including mastodons, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, ancient horses, camels, and Florida spectacled bears. Mixed in with the animal bones were human remains and artifacts. The implication was staggering. Humans and Ice Age negafauna had occupied this cave at the same time, probably when the water table was lower and the spring was dry. Today, the site is privately owned and operated as a diving and snorkeling facility. Swimming is not permitted, only diving and snorkeling. The cave is shaped like an inverted mushroom, wider underwater than at the surface. Certified divers can descend into the depths, but the underwater passages are narrow and some are completely blocked, making it genuinely dangerous for anyone without proper training. Fossils from the site are on display at the University of Florida's Museum of Natural History. 14. The Devil's Tree, Port St. Lucie. In Oak Hammock Park, a public green space in an otherwise unremarkable suburb on Florida's Treasure Coast, there is a large oak tree that the city once tried to cut down and could not. According to local accounts, workers who attempted to remove the tree reported their chainsaws stalling, their equipment malfunctioning, and an overwhelming feeling of dread that made several of them refuse to continue the job. The tree still stands. The reason people wanted it removed is the history attached to it. In 1971, a series of murders occurred in the area, and the bodies of at least 2 victims were found near or beneath this particular tree. The killer was identified as Jared John Schaefer, a Martin County Sheriff's deputy who was convicted of 2 murders and suspected of being connected to as many as 30 more across Florida. He had used isolated areas like the Oak Hammock to carry out his crimes, and the tree became associated with the worst of them. Locals began reporting strange phenomena around the tree: unexplained sounds, sudden temperature drops, equipment failures, a persistent feeling of being watched. The city eventually gave up trying to remove it. Visitors who go to Oak Hammock Park today will find the tree easily enough. It looks like any other large oak, but walk up to it at dusk when the park is emptying and the Spanish moss is swaying in a wind you cannot quite feel on your skin, and you will understand why people do not go there alone. 13. Florida State Hospital. Chattahoochee, 40 miles west of Tallahassee, on the bank of the Apalachicola River, sits the oldest continuously operating psychiatric institution in Florida, and one of the most notorious in the American South. The grounds began their life in the 1830s as the Apalachicola Arsenal, a military supply depot during the Seminole Wars. The first engagement of the Civil War in Florida took place here in January of 1861, when Confederate militia from Quincy seized the arsenal from Union soldiers. After the war, the property was converted into Florida's first state penitentiary. A warden named Malachi Martin gained a reputation for using prison labor to build his personal houses and tend his private vineyards, while inmates suffered under conditions so appalling that a book published in 1891 described the place as the American Siberia. In 1876, the prisoners were relocated to Raiford, and the facility was repurposed as the Florida Asylum for the Indigent Insane. For nearly a century, Chattahoochee was the only state mental institution in Florida. Thousands of men, women, and children were committed there, many of whom were not mentally ill at all. People were confined for epilepsy, for sunbathing nude, for smoking, for menopause, for being inconvenient to their families. Treatments included electroconvulsive therapy, insulin shock, and lobotomies. The conditions were investigated repeatedly. Lawsuits followed. The case of a man named Kenneth Donaldson, who was confined for 15 years despite showing no danger to himself or others, reached the United States Supreme Court in 1975. The court ruled his confinement unconstitutional, a decision that helped reshape mental health law across the country. The hospital still operates today, treating patients with severe mental illness, many of them forensic commitments from the court system. The original Arsenal buildings, among the oldest government structures in the state, are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The public cannot tour the facility, but you can drive through the town of Chattahoochee, see the old brick buildings behind the fences, and understand why, for generations, the name of this town was used as a threat. 12. Cassadaga. Volusia County, 35 miles north of Orlando, past the outlet malls and the suburban sprawl, and the billboards advertising personal injury attorneys. There is a community of approximately 100 residents, where every single one of them is either a certified medium, a healer, or a spiritualist minister. Welcome to the Cassadaga Spiritualist Camp, founded in 1875 by George P. Colby, a trance medium from New York who claimed that a spirit guide named Seneca led him to this particular patch of Central Florida and told him to establish a community dedicated to communication with the dead. Colby did exactly that. The camp was officially chartered in 1894, and it has operated continuously ever since, making it one of the oldest active spiritualist communities in the United States. Residents must be certified by the camp's board before being permitted to practice, and the certification process is not casual. The community maintains its own hotel, bookstore, and church, and offers readings, healings, and spiritual counseling to visitors. Walking through Cassadaga during the day feels like visiting any quiet Florida town, just one with more wind chimes and fewer chain restaurants. Walking through it at dusk is a different experience entirely. The streets are narrow and unlit. Spanish moss hangs from every tree. Houses built in the 1920s sit low to the ground, their porches dark. There is an object in the woods near the camp called the Devil's Chair, a brick bench in the Cassadaga Cemetery where, according to local legend, anyone who leaves an unopened can of beer on the seat overnight will find it empty by morning. The explanation offered by skeptics is that homeless individuals drink the beer. The explanation offered by residents is that the devil drinks it himself. 11. Stiltsville, Biscayne Bay. 1 mile off the coast of Key Biscayne, standing on wooden stilts in the shallow waters of Biscayne Bay, is a collection of 7 surviving structures that were once part of a much larger community of offshore buildings. At its peak in the 1960s, Stiltsville included 27 structures, including private clubs, bars, and residences, all perched above the water on wooden pilings, like something out of a fever dream about the end of civilization. The community began in 1933 when a man named Eddie Walker built a shack on stilts over the shallow flats and used it to sell bait and beer to fishermen. The concept caught on, and over the next 3 decades, more structures appeared. The Quarterdeck Club became famous for hosting gambling and parties that drew Miami's wealthy and connected. Hurricane Betsy in 1965 destroyed several buildings. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 destroyed more. Fires claimed others. By the 2000s, only 7 remained. The structures now sit within the boundaries of Biscayne National Park, and a nonprofit organization called the Stiltsville Trust manages them. They are not open to the public for casual visits. You cannot dock your boat and walk inside. They sit out there on the water, visible from shore, looking like the remnants of a world that decided to build itself on nothing and then slowly, inevitably, lost everything to storms and time. 10. Launch Complex 34. Cape Canaveral. On the evening of January 27, 1967, astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee were sealed inside the Apollo 1 command module at Launch Complex 34 for a routine plugs-out test. The exercise was considered non-hazardous. There was no fuel aboard. The pyrotechnics had been disabled. Nobody expected anything to go wrong. At 6:31 in the evening, a spark from faulty wiring ignited the pure oxygen atmosphere inside the cabin. The fire consumed the interior in approximately 5 seconds. The hatch, which opened inward and required 90 seconds to unseal under ideal conditions, could not be opened. All 3 astronauts died. The disaster shocked the nation and forced a complete overhaul of spacecraft safety protocols, cabin atmosphere composition, and hatch design. The Apollo program was delayed for 20 months. When it resumed, Apollo 7 launched from this same pad on October 11, 1968, the last mission ever to use Launch Complex 34. After decommissioning, the umbilical tower and service structure were demolished. What remains is the massive concrete launch pedestal, the 2 steel flame deflectors, and the blockhouse. A plaque reads, "Dedicated to the living memory of the crew of the Apollo 1, ad astra per aspera. A rough road leads to the stars." The complex is designated abandoned in place, which means no maintenance is performed. The concrete is cracking, the steel is rusting. Weeds grow through the pad. Visitors describe an overwhelming heaviness at the site, a quality of silence that feels different from ordinary quiet. The pad sits on Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, a working military facility, and can only be visited through certified tours. Most people drive right past it on their way to Kennedy Space Center without ever knowing it is there. If you have made it this far, and these places are giving you a reason to rethink what you thought you knew about Florida, do me a favor and subscribe. These videos take real research, and every subscription tells me they are reaching the right people. 9. Old Raiford Prison, Union County. In 1876, the inmates from the Chattahoochee Penitentiary were transferred to a new facility in Raiford, a town so small it barely registers on a map. That facility grew into what is now known as Florida State Prison, one of the most infamous correctional institutions in the American South. The original buildings from the late 19th century are largely gone. But the prison complex remains active, and its history is soaked in violence, execution, and despair. Florida State Prison housed the state's electric chair, known as Old Sparky, from 1924 until 2000, when lethal injection became the primary method. 266 people were executed in that chair. Serial killer Ted Bundy was electrocuted here in January of 1989. The execution drew crowds who gathered outside the prison gates with signs and celebration. A spectacle that made national news. The area surrounding the prison is isolated, flat, and featureless. Union County has a population of roughly 15,000 people, spread across 240 square miles of pine forest and agricultural land. There is very little reason to be in Raiford, unless you are visiting an inmate, or you took a very wrong turn. The town itself has a gas station, a dollar store, and the weight of 150 years of institutional suffering sitting on top of it like a stone. 8. Skunk Ape Research Headquarters, Ochope. On the Tamiami Trail, the 2-lane highway that cuts across the Everglades between Miami and Naples, there is a small wooden building surrounded by airboats and cypress trees, where a man named Dave Sheely has spent most of his adult life tracking and documenting a creature he calls the Skunk Ape. The Skunk Ape is Florida's version of Bigfoot, described as a large bipedal, foul-smelling primate that inhabits the deepest sections of the Everglades. Sheely claims to have first seen one in 1974, when he was 10 years old. He has been looking ever since. The Skunk Ape Research Headquarters doubles as a small museum and gift shop. Inside, you will find plaster casts of alleged footprints, photographs of questionable provenance, newspaper clippings, and a collection of Everglades wildlife in enclosures behind the building, including alligators, turtles, and snakes. Sheely takes the subject seriously. He speaks with conviction and specificity about the creature's habitat, diet, and behavior, and he has appeared on multiple television programs. Whether the skunk ape exists is beside the point. What matters is the setting. The Tamiami Trail crosses one of the most remote and inhospitable landscapes in the eastern United States. The Everglades are not a swamp in any simple sense. They are a shallow, slow-moving river of grass that stretches from Lake Okeechobee to the tip of the peninsula. And the sections near Okope are as wild and empty as anything in the country. Standing behind Sheely's headquarters at dusk, looking south into the sawgrass and cypress hammocks, you will hear sounds you cannot identify, and you will understand why someone might believe that something undiscovered lives in there. 7. Warm Mineral Springs, North Port, in Sarasota County, approximately 10 miles inland from the Gulf Coast. There is a perfectly circular spring that measures 230 feet in diameter. Fed by water that rises from deep within the Florida aquifer, at a constant 87 degrees Fahrenheit. The water contains over 50 dissolved minerals, and the sulfurous smell is detectable from the parking lot. People have been coming here for decades to soak in the water, claiming it eases arthritis, back pain, and the general indignities of aging. That alone would make it interesting, but not unusual. What makes warm mineral springs extraordinary is what scientists found at the bottom. In the 1970s, divers discovered human remains in an underwater cave roughly 40 feet below the surface. Carbon dating placed the remains at approximately 10,000 years old, making them among the oldest ever found in North America. Additional dives recovered the remains of extinct Pleistocene animals, stone tools, and other artifacts, suggesting that humans used this spring as a water source during the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and much of Florida's current coastline was dry land. The spring sits inside a sinkhole that is at least 200 feet deep, with underwater ledges, caves, and passages that remain only partially explored. Diving in the spring is restricted and requires special permits. The combination of extreme depth, limited visibility below the mineral-laden surface layer, and narrow underwater passages has made this one of the more dangerous dive sites in Florida. 6. Kingsley Plantation. Fort George Island, on the northern bank of the Fort George River, just east of Jacksonville, stands the oldest surviving plantation house in Florida. It was built around 1814 by Zephaniah Kingsley, a slave trader, plantation owner, and one of the most contradictory figures in Florida's colonial history. Kingsley operated plantations across northeastern Florida and was one of the largest slaveholders in the territory. He was also married to Anna Madge Jai, an African woman he had purchased as a slave in Cuba and subsequently freed. The plantation grounds include the main house, a kitchen building, a barn, and the remains of 23 slave cabins arranged in a semicircle. The cabins are constructed from tabby, a building material made from burned oyster shells, sand, and water. Most of the cabins are in various stages of ruin. Walking through the semicircle of crumbling walls with the river behind you and the live oaks overhead produces a silence that is not peaceful. It is the silence of a place where human beings were held as property and worked until they broke. The site is now a unit of the Temecuen Ecological and Historic Preserve, managed by the National Park Service. Admission is free. It is one of the few places in Florida where the physical architecture of slavery is still visible and preserved. 5. Fort Jefferson. Dry Tortugas. 70 miles west of Key West, farther from the American mainland than some Caribbean islands, a massive hexagonal brick fortress rises from a tiny coral island in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. Fort Jefferson is the largest masonry structure in the Western Hemisphere. Construction began in 1846 and continued for over 30 years, but the fort was never completed and never saw combat. Instead, it became a prison. During and after the Civil War, the fort held deserters and other military prisoners, including Dr. Samuel Mudd, the physician, convicted of conspiracy in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln for setting the broken leg of John Wilkes Booth. Mudd spent 4 years at Fort Jefferson, and during the yellow fever outbreak that killed the fort's physician, he volunteered to treat the sick. He was eventually pardoned. The isolation of the Dry Tortugas is absolute. The only ways to reach Fort Jefferson are by seaplane or a 2.5-hour ferry from Key West. There are no bridges, no roads, and no permanent residents. The surrounding waters are home to sharks, barracuda, and some of the strongest currents in the Florida Keys. The fort itself is slowly crumbling. Brick walls are collapsing. Archways are sagging. Trees grow from the ramparts. Standing inside the empty parade ground at sunset, 70 miles from civilization, with nothing but ocean in every direction, you understand why this was considered the ideal place to put people who were never supposed to come back. 4. Higgs Beach. Key West. On the south side of Key West, facing the Atlantic, there is a public beach that tourists visit every day for the white sand and the turquoise water and the sunset that everyone photographs as if nobody has ever seen the sun go down before. Most of them have no idea that they are sunbathing on top of a cemetery. In 2002, construction workers excavating the area behind the beach for a new county building discovered human remains. a lot of them. Archaeologists ultimately identified the remains of over 295 individuals buried in unmarked graves. The bodies dated to the mid-19th century and included African men, women, and children who had been rescued from illegal slave ships intercepted by the U.S. Navy after the international slave trade was banned. The rescued Africans were brought to Key West and housed in temporary camps, while authorities decided what to do with them. Many died from disease, malnutrition, and the trauma of the Middle Passage. They were buried without markers in a mass grave that was eventually built over and forgotten. For over 150 years, people walked, drove, and played on the ground above them without knowing they were there. Today, a memorial at the site commemorates the African burial ground. It is a quiet, dignified space near the edge of the beach, easy to miss if you are not looking for it. The remains that were excavated have been reinterred with proper ceremony, but the ground beneath Higgs Beach still holds the dead, and not all of them have been found. 3. Koreshan State Park. Estero. In 1894, a man named Cyrus Teed led a group of followers from Chicago to the banks of the Estero River in southwest Florida, where they established a utopian community called the Koreshan Unity, based on a theory that the Earth is hollow and that humanity lives on the inside surface of a concave sphere, looking inward at a universe contained within. Teed, who insisted on being called Koresh, believed he had been divinely inspired to reveal this truth, and that his settlement in Florida would become the capital of a new world order. At its peak, the community had approximately 250 residents. They practiced communal living, celibacy, and a form of alchemy. They built a printing press, a bakery, a store, and a series of residential buildings along the river. They also built an elaborate mechanical device called the rectilineator, which they used to measure the curvature of the Earth's surface, and which, they claimed, proved that the surface curves upward rather than downward, confirming their theory. Teed died in 1908. His followers expected him to rise from the dead. They waited. He did not rise. The community slowly declined. By the 1960s, the last surviving members donated the land to the state of Florida, and it became a state park. The original buildings are preserved and open to visitors, walking through the settlement along the river, past the restored structures and the interpretive signs explaining that the people who built them believed the sun was at the center of a hollow earth and that they were living on the inside of it, is one of the more disorienting historical experiences Florida has to offer. 2. Cassadaga Cemetery, the Devil's Chair. If the spiritualist camp in Cassadaga is the living heart of Florida's supernatural tradition, then the cemetery at the edge of town is its quiet, unresolved subconscious. The Cassadaga Cemetery is small, shaded, and unremarkable in every way except for the brick bench near the rear of the grounds that locals call the Devil's Chair. The legend varies depending on who tells it. In some versions, sitting on the chair at midnight allows you to communicate with Satan directly. In others, an unopened can of beer left on the seat will be found empty by morning, consumed by the devil himself. In the most restrained version, the bench is simply a memorial that acquired a reputation because of its proximity to a town full of people who speak to the dead for a living. And once a place like that gets a reputation, the reputation feeds itself. What is undeniable is the atmosphere. The cemetery sits on a wooded hill behind the camp, and at night it is completely dark. There are no streetlights. The nearest house is barely visible through the trees. The Spanish moss hangs thick and low. The bench sits there, empty, waiting for someone to sit in it, and most people who visit choose not to. 1. The last entry on this list is not a single place. It is a place so large and so incomprehensible that reducing it to a single location would be dishonest. The Everglades cover approximately 1.5 million acres of the southern tip of the Florida Peninsula. It is the largest subtropical wilderness in the United States, and one of the least understood. People think of the Everglades as a swamp. It is not. It is a river, a very shallow, very wide, very slow river of grass that moves south from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay at a rate so gradual you would never detect it. The water is rarely more than a foot deep across vast stretches of sawgrass prairie, but the ecosystem it supports is staggeringly complex. Alligators, crocodiles, Florida panthers, manatees, over 360 species of birds, dozens of species of snakes, and an invasive population of Burmese pythons that may now number in the hundreds of thousands. Going into the Everglades alone is not illegal. It is simply unwise. The landscape looks the same in every direction. There are no landmarks. Cell service does not exist in most of the interior. The water is dark and tannic. The ground beneath it is limestone, pitted with solution holes that can swallow you to your waist without warning. Mosquitoes in the wet season are not merely annoying, they arrive in clouds dense enough to obscure your vision. And the wildlife is not decorative. An American alligator does not care that you are a tourist. The Everglades are not a single story. They are thousands of stories stacked on top of each other over 10,000 years of human habitation. From the Calusa and Tequesta peoples to the Seminole Wars to the drainage projects of the early 20th century that nearly destroyed the system entirely. It is a place of extraordinary beauty and genuine danger, and it does not forgive carelessness. Florida is not what the brochures tell you. It is not just sunshine and theme parks and early bird specials. It is a launch pad where 3 men died reaching for the stars. It is a cave full of Ice Age bones beneath a hole that smokes like hell. It is a hollow earth colony and a spiritualist village, and a fortress prison 70 miles from shore. It is a tree that chainsaws will not cut, and a cemetery bench where the devil drinks beer. It is 1.5 million acres of grass and water and teeth, and it is waiting. I am an old man, and old men know when a place is trying to tell you something. Take care of yourselves.